Hey friends, tonight we are doing something a little different. Instead of simply observing the prehistoric past from a comfortable distance, we are dropping you directly into it. Not metaphorically, not as a thought experiment you can opt out of. Tonight, you are physically, bewilderingly, and somewhat inconveniently lost in time, specifically 3.5 million years ago, during a period geologists and paleontologists call the Pliocene epoch. Your modern phone has no signal, your coffee is not coming, and the world outside looks almost familiar enough to be reassuring, which, honestly, makes it stranger. You probably wouldn't survive this for very long, and your modern brain is already going to have some strong opinions about that. But that's fine, because tonight, we are not here to survive. We are here to witness. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I genuinely love reading those. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You come too slowly. There is no dramatic flash of light, no spinning tunnel, no cinematic arrival. One moment, you were wherever you were, and now you are lying on your back in tall, dry grass, staring up at a sky so blue and so enormous that it takes your breath away before you've even had a chance to gather your thoughts. The sun is high and warm. A breeze moves across the grass in slow, patient waves. Somewhere nearby, something is calling. A bird, maybe, though the sound is slightly off, slightly wrong in a way you cannot immediately name. You sit up. The first thing you notice is the smell. It is clean in a way that modern air simply is not. There is no exhaust, no industrial undertone, no faint chemical signature of a world built on combustion and convenience. The air smells like grass and soil and something faintly mineral, like rain that fell a long time ago and soaked deep into the earth. You take a long breath and feel, for just a moment, genuinely peaceful. Then you notice everything else. The savanna stretches out around you in every direction. To the east, the land rises gently toward a line of low hills shimmering in the heat. To the west, a scattering of flat-topped acacia trees breaks the horizon, or at least trees that look extremely similar to acacias, because almost nothing here is quite what you would call modern. The grass is tall and golden and moves like something alive. Insects click and hum at frequencies. You feel as much as here. You are, your best instincts tell you, somewhere in what will one day be Eastern Africa. But that continent is still in the early stages of becoming itself. The Great Rift Valley is still being slowly, violently negotiated by the Earth's own tectonic restlessness. The landscape you are looking at will change so dramatically over the next 3 million years that nothing you can see right now would be recognizable to someone standing in the same geographic location today. Which is a strange thing to sit with while you're just trying to figure out which direction is north. Here is your first piece of grounding information, offered gently. The Pliocene epoch lasted from approximately 5.3 million years ago to about 2.6 million years ago. You have landed, more or less, in the middle of it. The Earth's average temperature is slightly warmer than today, perhaps 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, warmer globally, which doesn't sound like much, but means the ice caps are smaller. Sea levels are higher by perhaps 25 meters in some estimates. And the ecosystems you are about to walk through are arranged in configurations that no living human has ever seen with their own eyes. And here is something scientists still debate with surprising passion: just how similar this Pliocene landscape would actually look to a modern observer. Some researchers argue that the core savanna biome has remained remarkably stable across millions of years. Others point to evidence that plant communities, soil chemistry, and rainfall patterns were different enough that even familiar-looking landscapes would have felt subtly alien to modern senses. You are, right now, the only data point available on this question, and you are not in a great position to take notes. The grass shifts again. The wind moves through it with a sound like distant breathing. You stand up slowly, brushing seeds and soil from your clothes. Your completely impractical modern clothes, which are going to be a problem in approximately 4 different ways before sundown. Your legs feel solid under you. The ground is firm and dry, baked by a sun that has been doing this for 4.5 billion years and is very good at it by now. Something moves at the edge of your vision. Far to the north, maybe half a kilometer away, a shape crosses the open ground between 2 stands of trees. It is too far away to make out clearly. It walks upright, mostly. It is small. It pauses, seems to look in your direction for a moment, then continues on its unhurried way and disappears into the shadow of the trees. You stand very still. Your heart does something interesting because you are 3.5 million years in the past, and you have just seen something that is almost human. You stay still for a long moment after that figure disappears into the tree line. Your instincts are running several calculations simultaneously, none of which are producing particularly reassuring results. But the grass continues its slow breathing around you, the insects continue their clicking indifference, and the sky above you remains so vast and so unbothered by your presence that you eventually exhale and decide to simply look up for a while. The sky is the right color. That is the first thing you confirm. It is blue, genuinely, deeply blue, in the way that skies in clean, high-altitude places sometimes manage even today. There are clouds moving in from the southwest, tall and white and architecturally ambitious, the kind that build themselves up through the afternoon heat into temporary cathedrals, before dissolving quietly after sunset. You recognize the sky. The sky, at least, feels like home. But the light is doing something subtle that takes you a few minutes to identify. It is slightly softer than you expect. Not dimmer. The sun is absolutely present and committed to its work. But the quality of the light has a different character. Part of this is the absence of particulate pollution, the fine invisible haze that modern industrial civilization has spread so evenly across the atmosphere that most people alive today have never actually seen truly clear air. Here, in the Pliocene, the light travels from the sun to your eyes, having bounced off almost nothing along the way. Colors are slightly more saturated. Shadows are slightly sharper. The golden grass glows in a way that feels almost cinematic, which is ironic, because no camera has ever captured anything quite like this. There is something deeply settling about standing under a sky this clean. Then again, the atmosphere itself is quietly different in ways you cannot see, but your body might eventually notice. Carbon dioxide levels during the mid-Pliocene were somewhere in the range of 350 to 400 parts per million, interestingly similar to levels recorded in the early 21st century, which is one of the reasons paleoclimatologists study this period so carefully. It functions as a kind of natural preview of where a warmer Earth tends to end up. Oxygen levels were also broadly comparable to today, which is good news for your continued breathing. You are not going to suffocate in the Pliocene, which frankly was not a guarantee you had thought to check before arriving. But here is where it gets quietly interesting. The precise composition of trace gases in the Pliocene atmosphere. Things like methane, nitrous oxide, and various aerosols produced by vegetation and volcanic activity was meaningfully different from today, and researchers continue to debate exactly how these differences would have affected everything from cloud formation patterns to the intensity of regional rainfall. What this means for you, standing in the grass right now, is that the weather here operates according to rules that are mostly familiar but occasionally surprising. The afternoon storm you can see building to your southwest, for instance, may behave slightly differently than your modern intuitions expect. You decide to watch it from a safe distance, which seems wise. The wind picks up slightly, carrying with it a collection of smells that your brain processes with great enthusiasm. There is pollen, enormous quantities of pollen, from grasses and flowering plants, going about the ancient business of reproduction. With complete disregard for your sinuses, there is the dry, warm smell of sun-heated earth, and underneath it all, something faintly sulfurous, a distant mineral tang that hints at volcanic activity somewhere beyond the horizon. The Rift Valley is still being formed, remember? The Earth here is geologically restless in ways that occasionally express themselves as tremors, eruptions, and the slow dramatic cracking of a continent trying to pull itself apart. Fortunately, nothing is erupting right now. You check the horizon just to confirm. All clear. You tilt your head back and look at the sun directly, briefly, because you are not entirely without sense, and notice that it looks exactly like the sun you know. This is because it is. The sun changes on timescales so vast that 3.5 million years is essentially nothing. In another 4 billion years or so, it will expand into a red giant and resolve the question of life on Earth in the most thorough way imaginable. But right now, it is a perfectly ordinary middle-aged star, doing its job with quiet reliability. This is oddly comforting. The moon, if you could see it tonight, would also look almost identical to the one you know, though it was technically very slightly closer to Earth than it is in your time. The moon drifts away from Earth at roughly 3.8 centimeters per year, so over 3.5 million years. That adds up to a little over 130 kilometers of additional distance in your era. Not enough to notice with the naked eye, but the tidal patterns on ancient coastlines were technically infinitesimally different. Scientists have confirmed this through the study of ancient tidal rhythms preserved in sedimentary rock, which is perhaps the most patient and methodical way anyone has ever checked the historical position of the moon. The clouds to the southwest are getting taller now. You can see the dark bruise of rain beginning to form at their base, and the air around you has changed again. Cooler now, charged with the specific electricity that comes before an African afternoon storm. The grass leans slightly eastward. The birds, which you have been hearing in scattered, casual bursts, have gone quiet in the particular way that birds go quiet when they know something you don't. You look back toward the tree line where that small upright figure disappeared. The trees stand still and dark against the brightening sky. Something about standing here, under this ancient sun, breathing this ancient air, watching an ancient storm build itself patiently over an ancient landscape, something about all of it makes you feel very small in the most comfortable possible way. Like you are not the point of anything happening here, and that is not a problem. It is, in fact, a relief. The first drops of rain are still 20 minutes away. You have just enough time to start walking. You start walking east, toward the low hills, because the storm is coming from the west, and the hills offer at least the psychological comfort of higher ground, even if your understanding of Pliocene weather patterns is limited to what you absorbed in the last 10 minutes. The grass reaches your waist in places, dry and whispering against your legs as you move through it. Every few steps, you disturb something small, an insect, a lizard. Once what appears to be a very small and extremely opinionated frog that leaps away with impressive conviction before you can get a better look. The ground beneath your feet is harder than you expected. The soil here is ancient and compressed, baked by millions of seasons into something closer to ceramic than the soft garden earth you might be used to. In places, it is cracked into irregular polygons by the dry season, shallow fissures that catch the light and make the ground look like the surface of something much older than itself. Which is accurate. Embedded in the soil, if you were to dig down even a few centimeters, you would find layers of volcanic ash, thin pale striations deposited by eruptions that happened decades or centuries apart, preserved in sequence, like the pages of a geological diary. Scientists in your future will use these ash layers, called tephras, to date fossils with remarkable precision. Right now, they are just something making the ground slightly crunchy underfoot. You walk for perhaps 10 minutes before the landscape begins to change. The flat savanna gives way gradually to something more textured. The ground rises and falls in gentle undulations, and in the low places between rises, the grass grows taller and greener, fed by subsurface water that doesn't quite make it to the surface. Occasional stands of trees appear, not forests exactly, but clusters of 3 or 4 trees growing close enough together to create pools of shade beneath them. The trees are not quite acacias, though they share the same broad, flat-topped silhouette. Their bark is pale and slightly papery, and their leaves are small and silver green, evolved to minimize water loss during the long dry season that has been part of this landscape's rhythm for millions of years. Here is something that might surprise you about this moment in Earth's history. The savanna you are walking through is actually relatively new. The expansion of open grasslands across Africa is one of the defining ecological stories of the last 10 million years, driven by long-term cooling and drying of the global climate and the evolutionary rise of grasses that could handle seasonal drought. By 3.5 million years ago, these grasslands had become established across large portions of eastern and southern Africa, but they were still dynamic and shifting, expanding during dry periods, contracting when rainfall increased, constantly negotiating their boundaries with the woodlands and forests that persisted in wetter areas. The landscape you are crossing right now is not a stable, permanent thing. It is a moment in a very long argument between grass and trees, and right now grass is winning, but only temporarily. Paleontologists continue to argue about exactly how open or closed these ancient African landscapes actually were. Some researchers, studying isotopes preserved in fossil soils, argue that hominins, like the ones living here, preferred mosaic environments, patches of woodland interspersed with open ground, rather than pure open savanna. Others interpret the fossil and geological evidence as suggesting much more open conditions. What this means for your walk is that you genuinely cannot be sure from 1 kilometer to the next what the terrain ahead will look like, which keeps things interesting. You crest a low rise and stop. Below you, maybe 200 meters away, a river winds through the landscape in slow, unhurried curves. It is not a large river, perhaps 15 meters across at its widest, shallow enough that you can see the pale, sandy bottom in places where the current slows. But its banks are dense with vegetation, tall reeds, broad-leafed plants you don't recognize, and a thick fringe of trees whose roots grip the bank with visible determination. The water is brown with dissolved sediment, moving with the particular lazy confidence of a river that has been doing this for a very long time and has no plans to change its approach. On the far bank, a group of animals stands in the shallows. They are large, not enormous, not yet, because the true giants of the African megafauna are still evolving toward their maximum expressions, but impressively substantial. They look broadly like antelopes, though their proportions are slightly different from anything you'd see in a modern wildlife documentary. Their horns curve in an unfamiliar way. Their legs are perhaps slightly longer relative to their bodies than you'd expect. They stand in the water with the relaxed, slightly bored energy of animals that have decided this is a good spot and are in no particular hurry to leave. You watch them for a while. The storm behind you has temporarily stalled, the clouds rearranging themselves with bureaucratic slowness. A breeze moves through the riverside trees, producing a sound like distant applause. One of the antelope-like animals lifts its head, looks in your direction with calm, amber eyes, decides you are not a problem, and returns to whatever it was contemplating in the water. You feel, briefly, like you belong here, or at least like you are being tolerated, which in the Pliocene amounts to roughly the same thing. The river in front of you will eventually become part of a drainage system feeding into what your era calls the Turkana Basin, a region in modern Kenya and Ethiopia that has produced some of the most important hominin fossils ever discovered. The sediments at the bottom of this river, settling slowly layer by layer, will preserve bones and teeth and occasionally stone tools for 3.5 million years, waiting patiently for paleontologists with brushes and notebooks and a great deal of sunscreen. Right now, though, it is just a river on a warm afternoon, and you need to find a way across. You find a crossing point about 100 meters upstream, where the river spreads wide and shallow over a bed of pale gravel. The water is cool against your legs, startlingly so, after the accumulated warmth of your walk, and it moves with enough current to require a little concentration as you pick your way across, stepping carefully from one firm patch of gravel to the next. The antelope-like animals on the far bank watch your crossing with the mild, faintly judgmental attention of creatures who have been navigating this river since before your species existed and find your technique unimpressive. You make it across without incident, which feels like a small victory. The far bank is softer, the soil darker and richer from centuries of seasonal flooding. Your feet sink slightly with each step. The vegetation here is denser than the open savanna behind you. Tall reeds give way to broader, leafed plants, and the tree fringe is thick enough to create genuine shade, which your body receives with quiet gratitude. You move through it carefully, pushing aside branches and stepping over roots until the trees thin again, and you find yourself at the edge of a small open area, perhaps 30 meters across, where the ground is flat and the grass is shorter, cropped close by animals that pass through regularly. You stop at the tree line. There are 5 of them. They are sitting, mostly, in the loose and comfortable way of people who are not in a hurry. 3 are adults, or what passes for adult here, because maturity arrives earlier in this lineage than it will in yours. 2 are younger, smaller, moving around the edges of the group with the barely contained energy of the very young, everywhere and in every era. They are small by your standards. The adults stand perhaps a meter to a meter and 20 centimeters tall, with bodies that carry the evolutionary negotiation between 2 worlds openly and visibly. Long arms, suited to a life still partly spent in trees. Legs designed for upright walking across open ground. a posture that is committed to bipedalism but retains a slight forward lean that no physical therapist in your century would endorse. These are Australopithecus, afarensis. Almost certainly, you are give or take geological uncertainty in the right time and the right place. And they are, at this precise moment, sitting in a patch of afternoon shade, eating something. You cannot quite tell what. Fruit, possibly. There is a pile of something small and dark in the middle of the group that is receiving steady, focused attention. The adults eat with a methodical patience that you recognize immediately because it is the same focused quiet that humans in your time bring to a meal they are genuinely enjoying. One of the younger ones reaches toward the pile, is gently redirected by the nearest adult, not harshly, just firmly, the universal parental gesture of not yet, and retreats to resume its investigation of a stick it found earlier, which appears to be the most interesting object in the world. You are standing absolutely still. Here is what you notice first. Before the science, before the context, before any of the carefully gathered knowledge your era has accumulated about these creatures, they feel familiar in a way that bypasses intellectual understanding entirely. The way the group orients toward each other, the casual physical contact, one adult resting a hand briefly on another's back, the sound the young one makes when it drops its stick, a short, sharp vocalization of frustration that is not quite a word, but is not quite not one either. Something in your nervous system recognizes all of this from a very deep place, something older than language. The widely accepted scientific understanding is that Australopithecus afarensis walked fully upright on two legs across open ground, making them committed bipeds in a way their earlier ancestors were not. The famous fossil footprints preserved at Laetoli in Tanzania, 3.66 million years old, left in volcanic ash by at least two individuals walking side by side, confirm a gait that was genuinely human-like in its basic mechanics, heel to toe, weight shifting smoothly from one foot to the other. But here is the part that continues to generate genuine scientific debate. How much time did they still spend in the trees? The anatomy of their shoulders, wrists, and fingers retains features associated with climbing. Curved finger bones, mobile shoulder joints, proportions that make more sense in a canopy than on flat ground. Some researchers argue these are simply evolutionary leftovers, vestigial features that hadn't yet been selected away. Others maintain, with substantial conviction, that afarensis was genuinely arboreal at night, sleeping in trees for safety, and that this was not a relic behavior, but an active, important part of their survival strategy. Looking at the group in front of you, watching the easy way one adult reaches up to grasp an overhanging branch just to adjust its position, you think the second camp might be onto something. One of the adults looks up. It looks directly at you. The moment stretches. Its eyes are dark and deep set beneath a prominent brow ridge, and the expression in them is one that you find genuinely difficult to categorize. It is not fear exactly, though there is alertness there. It is not aggression. It is something more like assessment, a careful, unhurried evaluation of what you are and what you represent, and whether any action is required. The calculation happening behind those eyes is not simple. It is not the blank reactive processing of a purely instinctual animal. There is something in there that is working through the problem with a patience and a depth that makes the back of your neck feel warm. Then it makes a soft sound, low, not quite a word, directed at the others. The group shifts slightly, orienting without alarm, and the young one abandons its stick entirely to press close against the nearest adult. They watch you. You watch them. 3.5 million years of everything that will ever happen passes invisibly in the space between you. You stay at the tree line for a long time, and eventually, the group decides you are not a threat worth reorganizing their afternoon around. This is either a compliment to your stillness or a commentary on your general impressiveness as a predator, and you suspect it is the latter. One by one, they return to what they were doing, the adults resuming their careful attention to the food pile, the younger ones drifting back into their loose orbit of play and investigation. You sink slowly into a crouch at the edge of the shade, resting your back against a tree trunk, and simply watch. This, it turns out, is one of the most quietly extraordinary things you have ever done. The food they are eating is clearer now that you have settled and your eyes have adjusted. It is a mixture of things, small dark fruits, certainly, but also what appear to be roots or tubers, pale and fibrous, which the adults work with their teeth and hands with practiced efficiency. One of them is using a flat stone to crack something open, a nut perhaps, striking with a focused, repetitive motion that produces a sharp sound each time. The technique is not elaborate. It does not require planning weeks in advance or the accumulated knowledge of a civilization, but it is absolutely intentional, and watching it produces a strange, doubling sensation, as if you are seeing both something ancient and something completely recognizable at the same time. Diet is one of the most fiercely studied aspects of Australopithecus life, and the picture that emerges from the fossil record is one of impressive flexibility. Analysis of carbon isotopes preserved in fossilized teeth suggests that afarensis consumed a mixture of foods, fruits, leaves, seeds, underground storage organs like tubers and corms, and possibly some animal protein, though the evidence for regular meat consumption at this stage of hominin evolution remains genuinely contested. The teeth are informative. Large flat molars suited for grinding tough plant material, canine teeth smaller than those of other apes, suggesting a diet that had already moved away from the fruit and leaf specialization of their forest-dwelling relatives. The nut-cracking adult finishes its work, extracts whatever was inside with a careful finger, and eats it with an expression of mild satisfaction that you recognize immediately as the face of someone who has just gotten into something that required effort and was worth it. But the food itself is only part of the story. What strikes you more as the afternoon light shifts and the group settles into a quieter rhythm is the texture of their social life. It is not chaotic. It is not purely reactive. There is a structure here, subtle, unspoken, but visible, once you know how to look for it. The adults do not eat in identical proportions. One seems to have priority access to the food pile, taking first and most without challenge. Another adult eats after, and the third after that. The young ones eat when there is space and opportunity, and the adults permit or redirect their access with a consistency that suggests this is not improvised each time, but is a pattern, a set of understood arrangements that everyone in the group navigates by feel. This is social hierarchy, expressed not through drama, but through the quiet choreography of who moves and who stays, who reaches and who waits. Scientists still debate the precise social structure of Australopithecus afarensis groups. Some analyses of fossil sites suggest they may have lived in relatively large, mixed groups, somewhat like modern baboons, with multiple adults of both sexes. Others point to significant size differences between male and female skeletons, a feature called sexual dimorphism, as evidence of a social structure more similar to gorillas, with dominant males presiding over smaller groups of females. The degree of this dimorphism in afarensis is itself contested. with different researchers measuring the same fossil collections and reaching meaningfully different conclusions, which is either a testament to scientific rigor or a reminder that paleoanthropology is sometimes as much art as science, depending on your disposition. The afternoon deepens around you. One of the young ones has found its way closer to your position, drawn by curiosity in the way that the young of almost every social species are drawn toward the unfamiliar. It stops about 4 meters away, watching you with enormous dark eyes, its small hands gripping a stem of grass that it is methodically destroying without apparent purpose. You hold very still. It tilts its head to one side. You have the sudden, powerful impression that it is doing exactly what you are doing, trying to figure out what category of thing you belong to and whether that category requires a response. It makes a small sound, not at you exactly, more like a general announcement to the universe. One of the adults looks up, locates the youngster's position, looks briefly at you, and then, in a decision that you find both flattering and slightly baffling, returns to eating. You have been assessed and filed under something like harmless curiosity, which is perhaps the most generous classification available. The youngster drops its grass stem and picks up a pebble instead. The shadows are lengthening now, the light turning from white to gold as the sun begins its long arc toward the western horizon. The storm that was building earlier has dissipated into a high, thin overcast that diffuses the light into something softer and more even. The temperature has dropped perhaps 3 degrees, barely noticeable, but the group notices it, shifting their positions almost imperceptibly toward each other, closing the distances between bodies in the instinctive way of warm-blooded creatures as the air cools. There is no fire. There will be no fire for a very long time yet. The earliest solid evidence of controlled fire use by hominins comes from sites roughly 1 million years old, and even that evidence is debated. Tonight, warmth will come from bodies pressed close together and from the residual heat stored in the earth during the long afternoon. The youngster with the pebble finally loses interest in you, which is humbling, and wanders back toward the group. You stay where you are, breathing quietly, watching the slow and patient business of surviving continue as it has for millions of years, with no awareness that it is remarkable, and no need to know. The group begins to move as the light shifts from gold to amber, gathering themselves with the unhurried efficiency of people who do this every evening and have a destination in mind. You watch them rise, the adults orienting briefly toward the tree line to the northeast, before setting off across the short-grassed clearing with a loose, easy gait. The youngsters fall into step without being asked. Within 2 minutes, they have crossed the open ground and been absorbed by the trees, and the clearing is empty and quiet, holding only the memory of their presence in a few disturbed patches of grass and a scatter of cracked shells near the food pile. You stand, stretch muscles that have stiffened during your long crouch, and consider your options. Following them seems reasonable. Night is coming, and while you have no survival plan worth mentioning, staying near the only beings in this landscape with any institutional knowledge of how to exist here strikes you as the least catastrophic available choice. You cross the clearing, skirt the food remnants, noting with interest the pile of cracked nuts and discarded fruit skins that represents this afternoon's dining, and enter the trees in the direction the group went. The woodland is immediately different from the open savanna. The light is lower and greener, filtered through a canopy that is not dense enough to be a true forest, but is sufficient to change the quality of everything beneath it. The ground is softer here, covered in a thin layer of leaf litter and the occasional exposed root. The sounds change too. Fewer insects, more birds, and underneath, both a low ambient hum that you eventually identify as wind moving through leaves. At a height you cannot see from where you are standing, you follow a faint path through the undergrowth. Not a path made by hominins, you understand, but one of those informal corridors that forms wherever animals pass regularly. Through the same space, the vegetation yielding slightly to repeated pressure over time. Then you hear it. It is not a dramatic sound. That is the first thing to say about it. It is not a roar or a crash or any of the cinematic announcements of large animal presence that your imagination might have prepared for you. It is more subtle than that. A deep, rhythmic movement through vegetation, a displacement of air, the soft ground registering something heavy with each step, in a way you feel through the soles of your feet before you fully process it through your ears. Something large is moving through the woodland about 50 meters to your left, paralleling your direction, unhurried. You stop walking. The something also stops. This is not ideal. The Pliocene is not a safe epoch for the unprepared visitor, and one of the primary reasons for this is that it is densely populated with megafauna, large animals that evolution has had millions of years to develop into extraordinarily effective versions of themselves. The roster of creatures sharing this landscape with your Australopithecus neighbors is one of the most spectacular and underappreciated in Earth's history. And right now, one of its members is standing 50 meters away in the trees, apparently thinking what you are most likely dealing with. Statistically, based on what paleontology tells us about this region and this era, is one of several possible candidates. There were large bovids here, relatives of modern buffalo, but with horn configurations that had not yet settled into the arrangements we recognize today. There were early relatives of the giraffe, some with antler-like ossicones of remarkable complexity. There were giant relatives of modern pigs, which sounds almost comical until you learn that some of them weighed over 500 kilograms and had faces that evolution had not been kind to in any conventional aesthetic sense. And then there were the predators. The Pliocene predator guild of Eastern Africa was formidably assembled. Large ancestral cats, some bearing the elongated canine teeth that would eventually reach their full expression in the saber-toothed cats of later epochs, moved through these landscapes with the quiet confidence of animals at the top of their respective food chains. There were ancestral hyenas, larger and more varied than their modern descendants. There were enormous crocodilians along every waterway, and there were hunting dogs, early relatives of the modern African wild dog, pack hunters whose cooperative strategies were already being refined by millions of years of evolutionary pressure into something extraordinarily effective. Scientists still debate exactly which large predator species were present in this specific region at this specific time, because the fossil record, for all its generosity, has gaps. The presence of certain species is confirmed by fossils from nearby sites. Others are inferred from related lineages. What is agreed upon is that the predator pressure on early hominins was real, constant, and significant, and that it shaped almost everything about how these creatures lived, where they slept, how they communicated, and how they moved through their landscape. The thing in the trees moves again. One step, two, it is moving away from you. You release a breath you had been storing with impressive efficiency, whatever it was, and you genuinely cannot see it through the vegetation. It has made its assessment and found you insufficiently interesting, which is the second time today you have been found wanting as a notable presence in this ecosystem. and you are choosing to interpret this as good fortune rather than an insult. But the encounter has recalibrated something in your awareness. The landscape, which had been settling into a kind of pastoral beauty in your mind, golden grass, gentle hominins, afternoon light, reveals itself now as something more layered and more serious than that. The same environment that produces quiet afternoons of nutcracking and social grooming also produces things moving through the trees at dusk that you cannot see and cannot outrun. Every creature here, including the ones you spent the afternoon watching with such comfortable detachment, navigates this tension every single day. They know where the predators den. They know the sounds that mean something dangerous is nearby. They have built their entire social architecture, in part, around the problem of being small and relatively slow in a landscape full of things that are neither. The trees ahead lighten. The woodland is thinning. You walk forward carefully and try to remember how to breathe normally. You emerge from the woodland onto a broad, elevated shelf of land, and the view that opens in front of you stops you completely. The ground drops away to the east in a series of long, stepped escarpments. Not cliffs exactly, but broad terraces of rock and earth descending toward a wide valley floor that stretches out below you in the last warm light of the afternoon. The valley is enormous. Even from this height, you cannot see its far eastern wall clearly, just a faint blue suggestion of high ground dissolving into haze. The floor of the valley is braided with water, not a single river, but a complex network of channels, some wide and slow, some narrow and quick, all of them catching the low sun and throwing it back at you in scattered fragments of light. Between the channels, flat sandy deposits and broad stretches of pale grass create a landscape that is equal parts land and water, a mosaic that shifts and rearranges itself with every season. You are looking at an early version of the East African Rift Valley, not the completed version, not the version that appears in geography textbooks and satellite images in your era. That took millions more years of geological argument to finalize. What you are seeing is the rift in its active, ongoing formation, a place where two sections of the African continent are being slowly, inexorably pulled apart by convection currents deep in the Earth's mantle. The process is extraordinarily slow by human standards, a few millimeters per year, but it has been going on for tens of millions of years and has already produced something of breathtaking scale. The escarpment you are standing above is part of the rift's western wall, and somewhere below you, in the sediments accumulating on that valley floor, the fossil record of hominin evolution is being quietly written in bone and ash. The sheer geological restlessness of this place is something you can almost feel underfoot. Here is the widely accepted understanding that makes this location so significant. The formation of the Rift Valley fundamentally altered the climate and ecology of Eastern Africa in ways that may have directly driven hominin evolution. As the rift opened and mountains rose along its edges, rainfall patterns changed. The western side of the rift remained wetter, maintaining forests where other ape lineages continued their arboreal lives. The eastern side grew drier, promoting the spread of open grasslands. The hominins, whose descendants you watched this afternoon, were living right at this ecological boundary, and many researchers believe it was precisely this edge environment, not pure forest, not pure savanna, but the shifting, unpredictable zone between, that drove the particular combination of adaptations that makes them so interesting. Paleontologists continue to argue about how direct this connection actually was. Some researchers, in what is sometimes called the savanna hypothesis, argue that bipedalism and increased intelligence were direct responses to open grassland life. Others find the evidence more ambiguous, pointing out that the earliest hominin sites are often associated with mixed or woodland environments rather than open plains. The debate has been running for decades and shows no sign of resolution, which is either frustrating or exciting, depending on how much you enjoy a good academic disagreement conducted very politely over very long timescales. You pick your way carefully along the escarpment edge until you find a place where the slope is manageable and begin to descend toward the valley floor. The rock under your hands, as you navigate the steeper sections, is warm from the day's sun, and it crumbles slightly at the edges in the way of rock that has been weathering for a very long time. In some places, the exposed strata are visibly layered, bands of different colored rock recording different geological episodes. Each layer, a frozen moment in the valley's history. You are climbing down through time as you descend. Each meter of rock face representing thousands of years of accumulated change. The air in the valley is different, cooler, more humid, carrying the particular green smell of water and the vegetation that grows near it. By the time you reach the valley floor, the light has shifted to a deep amber, and the shadows are long and soft across the sandy ground. The largest river channel is perhaps 100 meters ahead, broader than the one you crossed earlier, moving with more authority and more color. A deep reddish-brown from the sediment load it is carrying down from higher ground. Along its banks, life is concentrated in the way that life always concentrates near water in dry landscapes. You can see birds working the shallows, wading birds of various configurations, some recognizable in their basic form, others carrying anatomical details that sit slightly outside your familiar categories. In the water itself, shapes move with the unhurried patience of large aquatic animals that have very little to be afraid of. At least two are clearly crocodilians, drifting with the current in that practiced stillness that makes them so extraordinarily effective, and you give the bank a respectful margin. The surprising detail that your era's science has revealed about these ancient river systems is the degree to which they functioned as highways for both animals and eventually hominins. The river valleys of the East African Rift were not merely sources of water and food. They were corridors of movement, routes along which populations spread and contracted with changing rainfall and vegetation. Fossils of the same hominin species turn up at sites hundreds of kilometers apart along these ancient drainage systems, suggesting that the rivers connected populations that might otherwise have remained isolated. You sit on a large flat rock near the water's edge, far enough from the crocodilians to feel comfortable making decisions calmly. The valley is filling with sound as evening approaches, bird calls multiplying and overlapping, insects beginning their nocturnal shift. Somewhere upstream, a sound of splashing that could be any number of things, and which you decide, on balance, not to investigate. The river moves past you with complete indifference, carrying its cargo of ancient sediment toward a distant lake, laying down the layers that will one day tell your species its own story. You watch it for a long time, saying nothing, because there is nothing to say. The sun does not set dramatically here. There is no sudden transition, no sharp line between day and night. Instead, the light withdraws gradually, like something being slowly and carefully folded away. The amber deepening to orange, the orange bleeding into a red, so saturated and so low on the horizon that it colors everything it touches. The river, the pale sand, the far escarpment wall, in shades that have no modern equivalent, because modern light pollution ensures that almost no one alive in your era has ever seen a sunset this uncontaminated by artificial brightness. You sit on your flat rock and watch it happen. The temperature drops with the light, noticeably and steadily, and you feel it first at the back of your neck and along your forearms. That specific cooling of exposed skin that signals the genuine arrival of evening. The Pliocene nights in equatorial Africa were not brutally cold by any standard, but they were meaningfully cooler than the days. And for a small-bodied hominin with no fire and no clothing, that difference was not trivial. The group you watched this afternoon was not shivering through Arctic conditions, but they were also not comfortable in the way that you, in your climate-controlled modern existence, have come to understand comfort as a baseline expectation rather than a daily achievement. The stars appear before the last light is fully gone. This is the thing about true darkness, the kind that existed everywhere on Earth before the invention of artificial light and that now exists almost nowhere. It does not arrive all at once. It layers itself gradually, the brightest stars emerging first while the sky is still deep blue, then more and more as the blue darkens, until the full inventory of the night sky is displayed with a clarity and completeness that your eyes, if they have spent their entire life under suburban skies, are genuinely not prepared for. The Milky Way appears as a physical structure, not a faint smear, not a suggestion, a genuine, three-dimensional seeming band of light arching from one horizon to the other, dense with stars in its center, fraying at its edges into individual points that your eye keeps trying to count and keeps losing track of. There are so many stars visible that the familiar constellations, the ones you might half remember from a childhood astronomy book, are almost impossible to pick out because they are surrounded by so many additional stars that the patterns dissolve into the general abundance. Here is something worth sitting with. The constellations you might be trying to locate look slightly different from this vantage point in time. Not dramatically, the stars move against each other on timescales of tens of thousands to millions of years, driven by their own proper motions through the galaxy. Over 3.5 million years, some of the familiar star patterns have shifted enough that the constellations of your era would be subtly unrecognizable. Certain stars having moved enough to alter the shapes that human imagination traced between them. The Big Dipper, for instance, looked noticeably different 3.5 million years ago, its handle stars having different relative positions. The familiar ladle shape distorted into something your pattern recognition instincts would struggle with. Scientists have calculated these stellar positions with impressive precision using known proper motion data, and the results are quietly disorienting in the way that only very large numbers applied to very familiar things can be. The sounds of the valley have fully shifted now into their nocturnal register. What was a daytime soundscape of birds and insects has become something richer and stranger, more layers, more depth, more urgency. Frogs have joined in considerable numbers from the riverbank, producing an overlapping chorus that rises and falls with the rhythmic coordination of something almost musical. Insects contribute frequencies that operate at the edge of your hearing, felt as much as heard, and underneath and between all of this, occasionally, other sounds, heavier, less predictable, the sounds of large animals moving through a darkness that belongs to them in a way it does not belong to you. You are very aware suddenly that you have no fire. The hominins you observed this afternoon almost certainly moved into the trees as darkness fell. The fossil and behavioral evidence strongly suggests that Australopithecus afarensis was a habitual tree sleeper, ascending to safe heights each evening to avoid the predators that owned the ground after dark. This was not a failure of ambition. It was an excellent survival strategy. The cats that hunted this landscape and the early relatives of lions and leopards were absolutely present here, were predominantly nocturnal, and the gap between a small bipedal hominin's nighttime capabilities and those of a large felid hunting in darkness was not a gap that intelligence alone could bridge. Not yet. Not for another 1,000,000 years or more. You look at the trees along the riverbank with a new and practical appreciation. The ones nearest to you are tall enough and branchy enough to offer genuine security, and you spend a few minutes identifying which ones look most approachable from a climbing standpoint because your ancestors climbed trees before they were your ancestors, and something in your muscle memory, however faint and buried, might remember how this works. A sound from directly across the river, a short, low cough that is not a cough, freezes every voluntary muscle in your body simultaneously. The silence after it is very loud. Then the frogs resume. The insects resume. The river continues its indifferent passage toward the distant lake. Whatever made that sound has either moved on or is being very patient. And in the Pliocene, the large things were often very patient indeed. You are moving toward the trees before you have consciously decided to do so, which is probably the most authentically prehistoric thing you have done all day. Your body, it turns out, has its own opinions about darkness and open ground, and sounds that should not be ignored. And those opinions are older than language, and significantly more insistent. The bark of the first climbable tree is rough and warm under your hands. You go up, the branch you settle on is broad enough to be secure, and high enough, perhaps 6 meters above the ground, to provide a genuine margin of safety between you and whatever made that sound across the river. You find a configuration where your back is against the main trunk, and a secondary branch supports your legs, and you arrange yourself with the careful deliberateness of someone who has never actually slept in a tree and is performing real-time engineering assessments about the consequences of rolling over in the night. It is not comfortable. It is, however, considerably preferable to the alternatives currently available on the ground below. The canopy closes around you with a quietness that is different from the quietness of open ground. Up here, the world reorganizes itself. The valley sounds that seemed so large and directionless from the riverbank are now filtered through layers of leaf and branch, arriving softened and repositioned, easier to distinguish from each other. You can hear the river more clearly from up here, paradoxically, its sound traveling upward, unobstructed, while the lower frequencies of the night creatures are partially absorbed by vegetation. The wind moves through the upper branches in long, slow pulses, and the whole tree responds with a gentle swaying that is either deeply soothing or deeply alarming, depending entirely on how you feel about heights and the structural integrity of wood. You grip your branch a little more firmly and decide to find it soothing. The canopy around you is its own complete world. And now that your eyes have adjusted to the darkness, which is not, up here in the open upper branches, as complete as it was at ground level, you begin to notice how populated it is. Small shapes move in the branches of neighboring trees. Nocturnal animals conducting their business with the brisk efficiency of creatures for whom the night is not a threat, but a working shift. Some are clearly primates, small, quick, navigating the branch network with a confidence that makes your own cautious perching look frankly amateurish. Others are harder to categorize, moving too quickly and too briefly through your field of vision to do more than register as present. The trees of the Pliocene African woodland were not passive backdrop. They were infrastructure for hominins like the group you observed earlier. The relationship with trees was complex and multi-layered in ways that go beyond simple shelter. Trees provided food, fruit, leaves, bark, and the insects and bird eggs that lived within them. They provided safety at night. They provided vantage points from which to survey the surrounding landscape for predators or resources, and they provided a social environment, a three-dimensional space in which the group could spread out, regroup, communicate across distances, and maintain the constant, low-level contact that social primates require to function as a coherent unit. There is a growing body of research suggesting that the cognitive demands of navigating a complex arboreal environment, remembering which trees, fruit at which times, mapping three-dimensional routes through a canopy, tracking the movements of other group members across an irregular landscape, may have contributed significantly to the expansion of hominin brain size over evolutionary time. The trees, in other words, did not merely shelter early hominins. They may have helped make them smarter. Paleontologists and evolutionary biologists continue to debate the relative contributions of arboreal life versus ground-based social complexity versus dietary changes in driving early hominin brain evolution. It is one of those questions where every proposed answer reveals three new questions underneath it, which is either the mark of a genuinely difficult problem or the mark of a field that is extraordinarily good at finding complexity where it exists. Something lands on the branch above you. You look up slowly, with the controlled calm of someone who has decided that sudden movements at 6 meters of elevation are inadvisable. A bird, large, dark, with eyes that catch the starlight and throw it back with an amber glow, regards you from approximately 1 meter overhead. It is not alarmed by your presence. It is, if anything, faintly annoyed, in the way of a creature that had a particular branch in mind and has arrived to find it occupied by something confusing. It adjusts its grip, ruffles its feathers in a gesture of dignified recalibration, and settles into a different posture that communicates clearly that it has decided to tolerate you. You decide to find this companionable. The night deepens around you in the tree, and as it does, your body begins the involuntary negotiations of extreme tiredness. Your eyes grow heavy. Your grip on the branch, which started the evening as a white-knuckled commitment, has relaxed into something more habitual. The swaying of the tree, which your nervous system spent 20 minutes objecting to, has been reclassified somewhere in your brain as rhythmic and therefore acceptable and therefore possibly pleasant. But before you fully surrender to the strange luxury of sleeping in a Pliocene tree, something else is happening in the canopy around you. Other members of the group, your group, you have started thinking of them, which is either charming or presumptuous, are settling into nearby trees. You can hear them, not loudly, but with the specific sounds of bodies, finding positions, branches receiving weight, the occasional soft vocalization that passes between individuals in the dark. They are close enough that the sounds are reassuring. They are far enough that everyone has their own space. The social geometry of the group, which operated on the ground through proximity and touch and shared attention, has reconfigured itself here in the trees into something more acoustic, more spatial, maintained through sound rather than sight. Scientists who study modern primates note that this kind of vocal contact, the soft calls exchanged between individuals settling to sleep, serves both social and safety functions simultaneously. It confirms group cohesion. It provides information about everyone's location, and it communicates to any predator listening from below that this group is together, aware, and not to be approached without consequence. The bird above you shifts on its branch. The river murmurs below. The stars turn overhead at a speed too slow to see and too constant to doubt. Somewhere in a nearby tree, the youngest member of the group makes a small sound, receives a soft answer from an adult close by, and goes quiet. You close your eyes, and the Pliocene holds you, gently, impersonally, the way it holds everything within it, without preference, without judgment, with the vast and patient indifference of a world that has been doing this for a very long time. You wake before dawn, which is to say, you return to something approaching full consciousness after a series of half-sleeps broken by branch adjustments, distant sounds, and one moment around what you estimated to be 2 in the morning, when something very large moved through the undergrowth directly below your tree, with the slow, unhurried confidence of an animal that knew exactly where it was going and had no interest in anything that wasn't already on the ground. You gripped your branch with the focused intensity of someone taking a very important exam and did not breathe for approximately 90 seconds. Then it passed, and the night resumed its ordinary texture, and you eventually drifted back into an uneasy doze that carried you through to the first gray light before sunrise. The dawn arrives in stages here, just as the sunset did. First, a softening of the darkness in the east. Not light exactly, but a reduction of dark. The deep black of the night sky thinning to a charcoal gray that slowly, over the course of perhaps 20 minutes, admits color. The horizon line becomes visible. Then the silhouettes of the far escarpment. Then the river below you, a faint silver thread in the gray light. The birds begin before the sun is anywhere near the horizon. A single voice at first, then two, then a cascade of sound building from the riverbank vegetation with the organized enthusiasm of something that has been waiting several hours for exactly this moment. You sit up, roll your shoulders against the stiffness of a night spent against bark, and look out over the waking valley. The air at this hour carries something new. It is cooler than the night air. Paradoxically, dawn often is, as the accumulated heat of the day has fully dissipated and the sun has not yet begun its warming work, and it moves from the northeast in a gentle, steady current that brings with it a smell you have not encountered since arriving here. It is faintly different, drier, dustier, carrying the mineral signature of somewhere far away, somewhere north and east, where the landscape is more open and more arid than this valley. That wind is telling you something. The Pliocene climate was not static. This is easy to forget when you are sitting in what appears to be a stable, established landscape. The grass, the trees, the river, the wildlife all suggesting a system in equilibrium. But the equilibrium was illusory, a temporary frame within a much longer story of change. The global climate during the Pliocene was in the early stages of a cooling trend that would eventually, over the following millions of years, produce the great ice ages of the Pleistocene, the glacial cycles that would cover the northern continents in ice sheets kilometers thick and fundamentally reshape every ecosystem on Earth. That future is invisible from here. The ice sheets don't exist yet. The mammoths that will eventually become emblematic of the Ice Age world are not yet the mammoths you might picture. The woolly giants are a later development, a cold climate adaptation, still millions of years away from its full expression. What exists in this moment is something more subtle, a planet in the early stages of a very long cooling conversation with itself. The first whispers of a climatic shift that will eventually shout. The widely accepted evidence for this comes from deep-sea sediment cores, cylinders of ocean floor sediment, drilled by research vessels and analyzed in laboratories. The chemical signatures of ancient ocean temperatures preserved in the shells of microscopic organisms that lived and died and sank to the seafloor across millions of years. These cores reveal that the Pliocene was punctuated by cycles of warming and cooling, driven by variations in Earth's orbit and axial tilt. The same Milankovitch cycles that drove later ice ages, but operating against a baseline temperature that was still warmer than today. Here is the surprisingly contested part. Researchers continue to debate how sensitive the Pliocene climate was to the carbon dioxide levels present at the time, and what that sensitivity tells us about how modern climate systems will respond to comparable atmospheric changes. The Pliocene has become, in your era's scientific community, one of the most intensively studied periods in Earth's history, precisely because it represents a warm world with CO2 levels similar to those humans have recently produced. What happened to ice sheets, sea levels, and ecosystems during the Pliocene warm period is not merely ancient history. It is, for certain researchers, a deeply urgent preview. You watch the light strengthen over the valley, and think about that for a moment. The group is stirring in the surrounding trees. You can hear them, the sounds of bodies repositioning, the soft early morning vocalizations that seem to serve as a kind of roll call, confirming that everyone is present and that the night's accounting has come out correctly. One by one they descend, moving through the branches with a practiced ease that your observation of last night told you was genuine skill rather than casual confidence. Reaching the ground, they orient briefly, checking the wind, scanning the open areas, reading whatever information the morning air is carrying, before moving off along the riverbank in the direction of the previous evening's crossing. The cool northern wind continues its steady arrival. There is something in it, not quite a smell, more of a quality that speaks of distance and of change, of landscapes very different from this valley existing just beyond the horizon. The African continent in this era is not the continent of your maps. It is larger in some places, smaller in others, its coastlines redrawn by sea levels that have not yet receded to their modern positions. Rivers drain into lakes that do not exist in your time. Mountains are slightly different heights. The whole vast landmass is in the middle of becoming the place you know, and it is taking its time about it. You slide down from your tree with considerably less grace than anyone who descended before you, landing with a thud that sends a nearby bird airborne in a burst of startled wings. The morning is cool and clear, and old beyond comprehension. You fall into step behind the group, keeping a respectful distance, and follow them into the strengthening light. The group leads you upstream along the riverbank for perhaps half an hour before they stop. And the stopping is interesting because it does not appear to be random. They do not halt because they are tired or because something has frightened them. They halt because they have arrived somewhere specific, a place they intended to reach, a destination held in memory and navigated toward through a landscape that, to your eyes, appears largely uniform, but to theirs is clearly mapped and annotated in ways you cannot read. The place they have chosen is a slight widening of the riverbank, where a low shelf of exposed rock juts into the water, creating a natural platform perhaps 10 meters long and 3 meters wide. The rock is a dark gray volcanic stone, smoothed on its upper surface by water and weather, but retaining enough texture to provide secure footing. Around its edges, where the bank soil has eroded away, you can see the exposed roots of the riverside trees gripping the rock below with patient tenacity. Downstream from the platform, the river deepens slightly, creating a pool that is calmer and clearer than the main channel. The group spreads across the platform with the easy familiarity of people returning to a known and valued place. And then, one of the adults does something that stops you where you stand. It picks up a stone, not casually, not the way you might pick up a pebble and skip it across water, for no reason beyond the mild satisfaction of the arc. This adult, one of the larger ones, whose movements throughout yesterday and this morning have carried a quality of deliberateness that distinguishes them from the others, picks up a specific stone from a small collection near the platform's edge, turns it in both hands with focused attention, examines it, and then carries it to the flat rock surface, where it sets it down with a purposefulness that communicates clearly that this is not the beginning of an action, but the middle of one. Something was thought about before the stone was picked up. A plan, however simple, preceded the movement. You sit down on the bank and pay very close attention. What follows is not dramatic. There is no sudden flash of innovation, no eureka moment, no visible crossing of a threshold. What there is, instead, is patient, methodical, focused work. The adult uses one stone to strike another, a hammerstone against a core, in a sequence of carefully angled blows that are clearly not random. Each strike is assessed before it lands. The angle is adjusted, the force is calibrated. Some strikes produce flakes of stone that are examined and set aside. Others produce something closer to what was intended, a sharper edge, a more useful shape. And these are handled with a different quality of attention, turned slowly in the fingers, tested against a thumb. This is not quite the Oldowan tool industry, the earliest formally recognized stone tool technology in the human lineage, dated to approximately 2.6 million years ago. Roughly 1 million years from right now, what you are watching is something earlier, something less formalized, possibly the kind of opportunistic stoneworking that some researchers believe preceded true tool industries by a significant margin. The widely accepted understanding in paleoanthropology is that the earliest confirmed stone tools appear in the fossil record around 3.3 million years ago at a site called Lomekwi 3 in Kenya, a discovery announced in 2015 that pushed the known origins of toolmaking back by approximately 700,000 years and immediately complicated existing narratives about who made the first tools and why. These Lomekwian tools are cruder than the later Oldowan industry, the flaking less controlled, the resulting edges less refined. But the intention behind them, the deliberate use of one stone to modify another, is unmistakable. Researchers continue to debate, with considerable energy, whether these earliest tools were made by Australopithecus afarensis specifically, or by another hominin lineage present in Africa at this time, or whether multiple lineages were independently experimenting with stone, working in a way that makes single-origin narratives overly tidy. The honest answer is that the fossil record cannot yet tell us with certainty whose hands held the hammerstones at Lomekwi, which means that what you are watching right now on this rock platform by this ancient river may or may not be directly ancestral to everything that followed. Every tool, every technology, every built thing in human history, and you have absolutely no way to know. This uncertainty sits in your chest like something both heavy and luminous. The adult finishes its work, examines the result, a stone with one edge that is now sharper than it was, and uses it immediately, drawing it across a piece of bark with a motion that produces a thin curl of material. The tool works. The adult uses it twice more, then sets it down on the platform edge with the casual precision of someone returning something to its place, and moves to join the others at the pool's edge. where the younger members have been splashing with the focused joy of the very young encountering water. You walk slowly to the platform and crouch beside the discarded tools. They are not beautiful objects. That is the honest assessment. They are rough and asymmetrical, their edges uneven, their shapes owing as much to the nature of the raw material as to any imposed design. But when you pick one up, carefully, reverently, and feel the weight of it in your hand, feel the deliberate edge against your fingertip, something happens that is difficult to articulate precisely. You are holding an intention that survived in stone, not the thought itself, that dissolved with the thinker long before any fossil formed, but the consequence of the thought, the physical record of a mind deciding that the world as found was insufficient and that something could be done about that. You set it back down exactly where you found it. The river moves past, unhurried, carrying its sediment toward the future. You remain at the rock platform for a while, after the group moves on, sitting with the tools and the river and the particular quality of silence that settles over a place once the people have left it. Then you stand, brush the stone dust from your hands, and follow the riverbank downstream in a different direction than the group took, moving slowly and with your attention spread wide, because you have realized that you have spent most of your time here focused on the hominins and have been neglecting the extraordinary catalog of other creatures sharing this landscape with them. This, it turns out, is an oversight worth correcting. Within 10 minutes of leaving the platform, you encounter the first large animal of the morning at close range, close enough to require an immediate and carefully calibrated response on your part, which is to say, you stop walking and become as boring as possible. It is a bovid, standing in the shallow water at the river's edge, drinking with the long-necked patience of a very large animal that has decided this is its moment and is not to be rushed. It is broadly reminiscent of a buffalo, same general architecture, same sense of tremendous structural commitment, but its horns sweep outward and then curve in a direction that no modern buffalo's horns quite manage, a configuration that evolution has since retired from the available options. It drinks. You watch. It finishes, raises its head, looks at you with eyes the size of small plates, and walks back into the tall grass with a dignity that suggests it has concluded you are not worth the energy of a reaction. You agree with this assessment and continue downstream. The Pliocene fauna of Eastern Africa was a remarkable and in many ways more diverse assemblage than the wildlife of the same region today. This is not immediately obvious because the modern African savanna is justifiably celebrated as one of the most biodiverse large mammal ecosystems remaining on Earth. But the Pliocene version had layers of variety that are now absent, extinct lineages, evolutionary experiments that ran their course, and concluded body plans that nature tried and eventually set aside in favor of other configurations. There were multiple species of early elephant relatives present in this landscape, not yet the African elephants of your era, but ancestral forms that carried their own variations on the elephant theme. Some had 4 tusks rather than 2, the lower pair shorter and shovel-like, used for stripping bark and digging. Others were smaller, more forest-adapted. The elephant lineage in the Pliocene was, in the language of evolutionary biology, still exploring its options, and the results of that exploration produced animals that no human alive in your time has ever seen outside of fossil reconstructions. Here is the surprising detail that tends to stop people. There were also ancestral giraffes here, but the giraffe family in the Pliocene was considerably more diverse than its modern single-species remnant suggests. Several lineages of giraffids roamed African and Eurasian landscapes, some with the familiar long neck and legs of the modern giraffe, others with shorter necks but elaborate ossicone structures, the bony head projections, of remarkable complexity. One group, the savannas, grew to sizes that exceeded modern giraffes, with body masses estimated at over 1,000 kilograms in the largest individuals. They were the tallest animals alive in this period, browsing the upper canopy of woodland trees with a reach that nothing else could match. Scientists still debate the precise diversity and distribution of these Pliocene giraffids, as the fossil record of this group has significant gaps. What is agreed is that the modern giraffe represents a dramatic reduction in the family's former variety, a group that was once ecologically rich and geographically widespread, has been reduced over millions of years of climate change and competition to a single surviving species. This reduction was already beginning in the Pliocene. Though it was not yet complete, you find evidence of the savannas before you see them, a series of depressions in the soft riverbank soil, each one larger than your entire foot, pressed deep by an animal of considerable weight moving with a long, swinging stride. The tracks lead away from the water into the woodland, and you follow them for a short distance before the trees open up and you see, perhaps 40 meters ahead, two animals browsing in the upper branches of a stand of trees, so tall that your eyes travel upward for longer than expected before finding the canopy. They are extraordinary, even from this distance, even with your limited reference points. The scale of them is immediately apparent, taller than anything you have encountered in this landscape, their long necks reaching effortlessly into branch levels that would require a ladder in your world. They move with a slow, rocking grace that belies their size, shifting their weight from one leg to another with the deliberate patience of animals that have nothing to hurry toward. Their coloring is different from modern giraffes, darker, less patterned, the spots less defined, and merging toward a more uniform deep brown at the shoulders. They do not notice you, or if they do, they register you somewhere below the threshold of concern. Closer to the ground, the landscape is populated with smaller dramas. Troops of ancestral monkeys move through the riverbank trees with rapid, chattering energy. Various antelope species graze in shifting combinations across the open ground between woodland patches. Enormous pigs, relatives of modern warthogs, but considerably larger and more architecturally ambitious about their facial features, root along the forest edge with the focused, businesslike intensity of animals that have identified a specific food source and intend to extract maximum value from it, and above all of this, riding the thermals that build as the morning warms. Large birds circle in patient spirals, some clearly raptors, with the broad wings and fixed, assessing gaze of dedicated aerial hunters. The whole system hums with the energy of 10,000 simultaneous negotiations between species: what to eat, where to go, who to avoid, when to move. You stand in the middle of it, perfectly unnecessary to any of it, and feel something that takes a moment to identify. It is gratitude. You find the group again by following sound. It reaches you before anything visual does. A complex, layered texture of vocalizations coming from a stand of trees, perhaps 300 meters north of where you have been watching the giraffids browse. It is not alarming sound, not the sharp, urgent calls you have already learned to associate with predator awareness. It is something more relaxed and more varied than that, a conversational quality to it, multiple voices overlapping in a way that carries the rhythm of exchange rather than the flat broadcast of warning signals. You follow it through the tall grass, moving steadily, and find the group settled in the shade of a broad, canopied tree at the edge of a small clearing, engaged in the kind of mid-morning social activity that appears to be as important to their daily structure as eating or moving. They are grooming, not all of them. Two of the adults are sitting apart, watching the surrounding landscape with the relaxed but genuine attention of animals that understand vigilance as a background condition of existence rather than an emergency response. But the others are engaged in the careful, methodical work of grooming, one individual working through the hair of another with focused fingers, occasionally removing something small and examining it with brief interest before discarding it. The recipient of the grooming sits with the particular stillness of an animal receiving something pleasurable, its eyes half closed, its body language communicating a quality of trust that is striking in its completeness. Grooming in social primates is not primarily about hygiene, though it serves that function adequately. It is, as primatologists have understood for decades, a social technology, the primary mechanism through which bonds are established, maintained, and repaired within a group. The physical act of grooming releases endorphins in both the groomer and the recipient, creating a neurochemical reward for social connection that makes the behavior self-reinforcing. Groups that groom together stay together in the most literal neurobiological sense. But what interests you most this morning is not the grooming itself. It is the sound that accompanies it. The vocalizations you followed here are not stopping. They continue throughout the grooming, a running accompaniment of calls and responses and what can only be described as commentary, short sounds that vary in pitch and duration and quality in ways that seem, to your listening ear, to carry distinct meanings. A short rising call that prompts a response from across the group. A longer, lower sound that seems to function as reassurance, offered and received between the grooming pair. A sharp double vocalization from one of the watchful adults that causes every head to turn briefly before the signal is apparently downgraded to not urgent, and the group resumes its previous activity. You sit quietly at the clearing's edge and try to listen with the same attention you would bring to a language you do not speak but are trying to understand. The science of Australopithecus communication is one of the most genuinely uncertain areas in all of paleoanthropology, for the straightforward reason that vocalizations leave no fossils. The anatomy is somewhat informative. The position of the larynx, the shape of the hyoid bone, the structure of the vocal tract can be inferred from skeletal remains and compared with living species, but the gap between what the anatomy could theoretically produce and what was actually said, if saying is even the right concept, cannot be bridged by fossils alone. What is known is that Australopithecus afarensis had a vocal anatomy that was intermediate between modern apes and modern humans, suggesting capabilities beyond the calls of other great apes, but likely falling short of the full phonetic range that Homo sapiens produces. Researchers continue to debate vigorously where exactly on this spectrum afarensis sat, some arguing for a communication system substantially more complex than any living non-human primate, others maintaining that true language, in any meaningful sense, required the later expansion of the brain and descended larynx that came with the Homo lineage. The honest answer is that nobody knows, and the honest acknowledgement is that this uncertainty is as interesting as any conclusion would be. What you can observe, sitting here at the clearing's edge, is behavior that clearly goes beyond simple stimulus-response signaling. The adult who issued the brief alert call and then apparently communicated an all clear did something that involved, at minimum, a two-stage assessment, first a detection and broadcast, then a reevaluation and correction. That reevaluation required holding the first signal in some kind of working memory while processing additional information and then producing a different signal to update the group's understanding. This is not nothing. This is not simple. One of the younger members of the group detaches from the grooming cluster and wanders toward you with the casual boldness that characterized its approach yesterday afternoon. It stops at its customary distance of about 4 meters, examines you with enormous, serious eyes, and then does something unexpected. It makes a sound, a short, rising vocalization, and then waits. The waiting is deliberate. There is a quality to the silence after the sound that is clearly anticipatory. It is, unmistakably, the posture of something that has asked a question and is curious about the answer. You make a sound back. Nothing sophisticated, a soft, low hum, the most neutral and gentle vocalization you can produce. It is not a word. It does not mean anything specific, but it is a response, offered in the same frequency range, at approximately the same duration. The youngster's eyes widen slightly. It makes another sound, different this time, shorter, with a falling pitch, and continues to watch you. You respond again, matching the shorter duration, if not the falling pitch. This exchange continues for perhaps 2 minutes, neither of you communicating anything with content, both of you communicating something about connection and attention, and the simple ancient fact of noticing each other across a distance that is simultaneously very small and almost incomprehensibly large. Then the youngster loses interest, as the young reliably do, and wanders back toward the group. You sit with the fading echo of that small exchange, turning it over quietly. Somewhere between that conversation and the one you are having in your own head right now, everything that makes your species what it is came into being. Slowly, incompletely, across millions of years of incremental change. The distance from that soft exchange in a Pliocene clearing to the words you are thinking in is both the longest journey in natural history and somehow not very far at all. The afternoon light has reached that particular quality that comes in the hours between midday and sunset, when the sun is still high enough to be authoritative, but has lost the aggressive verticality of noon and begun its slow lean toward the horizon. The shadows are longer than they were this morning, angled and specific, and the landscape has settled into a warm, drowsy rhythm that feels like the natural tempo of this time of day in this part of the world. Slower, softer, the animals mostly resting in shade, the insects maintaining their steady background conversation, the river continuing its patient work below. You have found a place to sit that you are reluctant to leave. It is a slight rise in the ground, perhaps 2 meters above the surrounding savanna, where a cluster of exposed rocks creates a natural seat facing east across the valley. From here, you can see the river, the tree lines, the distant escarpment, and a broad sweep of open grassland where, if you watch long enough, you can usually see something moving. A distant herd of bovids crossing between woodland patches, a pair of large birds descending to the ground in the specific steep-angled dive of something that has identified lunch, the occasional slow drift of a dust column raised by animals you cannot yet see. You have been sitting here long enough that your presence has stopped registering as a disruption to the local ecosystem. A small lizard has taken up a position on the rock beside you, warming itself with the focused commitment that lizards bring to thermoregulation. Apparently having assessed you as a large, warm, harmless feature of the landscape rather than a threat, you choose to find this deeply flattering, and in this quiet, In this afternoon stillness, you find yourself thinking about what you actually know about this world versus what you are experiencing of it, and the gap between those two things is wider and more interesting than you expected. The fossil record of the Pliocene is extraordinary by any reasonable standard. The Turkana Basin alone, the region whose ancient rivers and lakes have been draining the landscape around you, has produced thousands of hominin fossils, representing multiple species across several million years of evolution. The site of Hadar in Ethiopia, discovered in the 1970s, yielded Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, specimen AL288-1, a partial skeleton representing approximately 40% of an individual who lived approximately 3.2 million years ago, whose discovery fundamentally reshaped our understanding of early human evolution, and whose name has become perhaps the most recognizable in all of paleoanthropology. Lucy was small, 1 meter tall, approximately 29 kilograms, female, somewhere between 25 and 35 years old at death. Her skeleton confirmed bipedal locomotion beyond reasonable doubt, while simultaneously revealing the mosaic of features, long arms, curved finger bones, funnel-shaped chest, that connect her clearly to an arboreal heritage. She was found at the bottom of an ancient lake margin, preserved by the particular combination of rapid burial, mineral-rich sediment, and geological luck that turns organic material into fossil rather than dust. The widely accepted conclusion from Lucy and the dozens of other afarensis specimens found since is that this species was both more human-like and more ape-like than earlier researchers had anticipated, not a simple intermediate form on a straight line from ape to human, but a genuinely distinctive creature with its own evolutionary solutions to its own ecological challenges. But here is what the fossil record quietly confesses. If you listen carefully enough, it is radically incomplete. The conditions required for fossilization are so specific, so demanding, so dependent on a precise sequence of circumstances: rapid burial, the right soil chemistry, the absence of scavengers, the right moisture levels, the absence of later geological disturbance, that the vast majority of organisms that have ever lived left no fossil trace whatsoever. Estimates vary, but most paleontologists accept that the fossil record represents something in the range of a tiny fraction of 1% of all species that have ever existed. For hominins specifically, the numbers are even more sobering. We have fossil evidence of perhaps a few thousand individuals spanning several million years of evolution across an entire continent. Researchers continue to debate, with genuine passion, whether the hominin species currently recognized in the fossil record represent the actual diversity of Pliocene hominins, or are simply the species that happened to live in environments conducive to fossilization. Some paleoanthropologists argue that there were likely many more hominin lineages present in this period than the fossil record shows. Lineages that lived in forest environments where fossilization rarely occurs, that are simply invisible to us because their bones dissolved rather than mineralized. Others maintain that the known fossil record, imperfect as it is, captures the broad outlines of hominin diversity reasonably well. What this means, practically, is that the group you have been following, the individuals you watched eat and groom and make tools and sleep in trees and exchange soft vocalizations in a clearing, may or may not be representative of the full range of hominin experience in this era. There may be other groups in wetter forests beyond the horizon or in drier uplands to the north, whose lives look different enough to constitute a separate story entirely. You would never know, neither would anyone in your time. The lizard beside you shifts, tilting its body to maximize its contact with the warm rock. You think about Lucy, 3.2 million years ago, lying at the edge of an ancient lake in what would become Ethiopia. You think about the researchers who found her, who spent years carefully extracting her bones from the sediment with tools designed for the purpose, who carried her in fragments to laboratories and spent decades studying what she could tell them. You think about the gap between lying down by a lake and being understood, however partially, millions of years later. Something about that gap, its size, its darkness, its occasional punctuation by a fragment of bone that survived against all probability, feels important in a way you cannot quite articulate. The fossil record is not a complete story. It is a collection of surviving sentences from a book that was almost entirely lost. What survives is precious beyond calculation. What is gone is immeasurable. You watch a bird cross the valley below you, moving from east to west with efficient wing beats, and disappear into the trees. The sun is lower now, committed to its evening direction, and the valley below you has begun its familiar transition from afternoon gold to the deeper, richer tones that precede sunset. You have been on this small rise for a long time, thinking, watching, allowing the Pliocene to simply exist around you without trying to categorize or understand every element of it. There is something to be said for that, for setting down the interpretive machinery for a while and simply being present in a place, even a place this remote from everything you know. The group has drifted back into your vicinity over the course of the afternoon, settling in the shade of the tree cluster below your rise. You can hear them from here, the soft ambient sounds of the group at rest, the occasional vocalization, the small movements of bodies adjusting positions. The youngest member is asleep, you think, pressed against one of the adults, with the complete physical surrender of the deeply unconscious young. The adults, who are awake, sit with the patient, outward-focused attention of creatures whose survival depends on never fully switching off, even during rest. You look at them for a long time, and then you look at your own hands. The hands of Australopithecus afarensis were not so different from yours in their basic configuration. The same 5 digits, the same opposable thumb, the same fundamental architecture that the primate lineage had been refining for tens of millions of years before this moment. The differences are in the proportions, in the slight curvature of the fingers, in the relative lengths that betray the different demands placed on those hands by different lives. But the essential design is shared. The same design that cracked nuts on a riverside rock this morning, writes novels and builds telescopes and plays piano in your era. That continuity is not nothing. It is, in fact, almost everything. The walk back to wherever you came from, back to the present, to the modern world, to the life that is waiting for you on the other side of 3.5 million years, begins, as all important journeys do, with simply standing up. You stand. The valley spreads below you in the last warm light, the river catching the sun in long, silver fragments, the escarpment walls glowing amber on their west-facing surfaces. The grass moves in the evening wind with its slow, patient breathing. A herd of bovids has appeared on the far side of the valley, small at this distance, moving with the unhurried efficiency of animals, following a route they know by instinct and by memory, worn into their behavior by a million repetitions. You take one long, deliberate breath of Pliocene air, clean, mineral, carrying pollen and grass, and the faint distant sulfur of a restless earth. You hold it for a moment, this air that has never been breathed by anyone from your century, that carries none of the history that comes after this moment, that exists in a world that does not yet know what it is in the process of becoming. Then you exhale, and with the exhaling, something shifts. The journey back is not dramatic. That seems right. The most important transitions rarely are. The world around you does not disappear in a flash or fold itself away with cinematic finality. It simply, gradually, gently, with the same patience it has brought to everything else, recedes. The sounds soften first. The insect chorus and the bird calls and the river's voice all becoming slightly less immediate, as if heard through a greater distance. Then the light changes quality. The ancient unfiltered Pliocene sun giving way to something slightly different, slightly more familiar. You carry three things back with you, none of them physical. The first is the face of the adult who looked up from the food pile yesterday and held your gaze across the clearing. The assessment in those dark eyes, the depth of the calculation happening behind them. The reminder that intelligence did not arrive in human history as a sudden gift, but accumulated slowly, incrementally, over millions of years of small advantages compounding in the bodies and minds of creatures trying their best to persist in a complicated world. The second is the weight of that stone tool in your hand. Rough, asymmetrical, deliberate, the physical record of a thought, the understanding that the impulse to reach beyond the world as given, to reshape it according to an internal idea of what it could be, is not a modern invention, but an ancient inheritance. Something that was already being practiced on a riverside rock platform before your species existed, before the ice ages began, before most of the creatures you share your world with had taken their modern forms. The third is harder to name. It is something like proportion, the understanding, felt rather than reasoned, of how large the story is that contains your life, how many chapters preceded yours, how many creatures lived and adapted and cared for their young, and navigated their landscapes, and eventually disappeared into the fossil record or into nothing, long before anyone was there to notice or record or remember them. Your life, and everything in it, every worry and plan and ordinary Tuesday, exists within that enormous context. And that context does not diminish your life. It holds it. It gives it a particular kind of weight and a particular kind of lightness. Simultaneously, the valley is almost gone now. The group in the shade of the tree cluster below you are the last thing to fade. The adults sitting in their patient, outward-facing attention. The youngster pressed in sleep against the warmth of a body that is safe and close and present. They do not look up as you go. They do not know you are here. The fossil record will not preserve your visit. No bone or tool or ash layer will mark the afternoon you spent watching them go about the ancient, ordinary business of being alive. But you were here, and now the lights are low, and the fan hums its soft background rhythm, and the Pliocene has released you back into your own time with gentle indifference, and your bed is warm and close, and the world outside your window is very modern and very loud and completely, improbably descended from everything you witnessed today. Let your body settle now, heavy and still. Let the sounds of tonight become the river. Let the dark behind your eyes become the valley at dusk. The grass moving, the first stars coming through. Let your breath find the slow rhythm of an ancient evening, deep and even and unhurried, the way everything breathed before there was anything to be anxious about. The escarpment glows its last amber in your memory. The river carries its patient sediment. The group breathes together in the trees. You are home. You are here. You are made of everything that came before you, and you are allowed to rest.